Hey everyone, welcome to this talk on Peter Watkins' The Journey. My name is Will Quaid. I want to say first and foremost, thank you all for engaging with this online. I know it's not quite as fun as in person, but I appreciate all of y'all's feedback and all of y'all's engagement. It means a lot. I am also really happy to be here once again at Conference on the Image, a conference that I've done a couple now of my favorite talks. And I wanted to say thank you first and foremost to the Image Research Network and the Common Grounds Research Network for awarding me with the Emerging Scholar Award, one of a few grad students here who are very happy to have received it and have it. And I just want to thank everybody for attending and for helping me achieve this award. I wouldn't have done it without the research network support and the journal support. So thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about Peter Watkins' The Journey, and that's what the title of this presentation is. Did you know that? Which, for those who have seen the film or have heard Watkins speak, is a refrain that he uses quite a bit. In kind of classic Watkins fashion, I'm not going to come prepared with a very big script. His films and The Journey in particular are open to revision, interpretation, and for creative collaboration. And I'm hopeful that in this even online module, we can do that together here. So what is the journey? And again, first, I will be moving in different parts of the screen, my square for where my head is. So apologies if it's a little scary as I jump around, but I'll mostly be in this corner. So what is The Journey, right? So the Journey is one of the lesser known films of Peter Watkins, the iconoclast docudrama political radical filmmaker from the UK who arose in popularity in the 60s with his nuclear strike mockumentary, The War Game, which won an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature, and as well as, his political, doomsaying political rhetoric in films such as Punishment Park and Privilege, and was mostly known for his artist biopic on Edvard Munch. So The Journey is a political documentary epic, and I mean that in every sense of the word. So The Journey, as you can see even from this cross-section of 9 different images, is a long documentary, which we'll get into the production and everything as well, about the global nuclear arms race as it was present in the 1980s. So while going over a dozen countries, dozens of interviewees as well. Peter Watkins and his crew of filmmakers and his crew in general, they go ahead and they interview people of very different kinds from very different places. So from the US to the UK to Mozambique to French Polynesia and everywhere in between. So while interviewing, Watkins and his crew document what do people know about the nuclear arms race, specifically families and young children? Do they know the consequences of them? And do they know exactly what the pressures are in their daily lives as a result of the nuclear arms race? So Watkins had always been a documentary filmmaker, but he had used kind of para-documentary or docudrama or mockumentary. The Journey represents a complete, total, formal documentary. It doesn't mean that it's not ideological, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have intent, but it does not have the kind of play with narrative and documentary or fiction and documentary the way that his other films had. And so in that case, the film is a more straightforward documentary in terms of its genre, but by far his most unwieldy and difficult to categorize film as far as where it moves and where it goes. And that's because it's not only a documentary epic, it's also a pedagogical endeavor. So when the film was released, Watkins decided that he wasn't done with the film. He teamed up with Ken Noley, Scott McDonald, and a few other allies he had in academia at the time in the late 80s and early 90s, and released a special full journal issue on The Journey, in which Noley, McDonald, Watkins, and others relate not only the production of The Journey, but its pedagogical and theoretical value as well. So as this was published in 1991, Watkins and his wife Vida Urbanavičiūtė also created their own user's guide. So for those who don't know, Watkins maintains his own website where he used to respond to many different calls for speaking engagements or, emails and things like that. He mostly doesn't respond anymore. I was lucky enough to chat with Peter when I asked him for the guide, and his son Gerard was able to help me as well. And they both, and one thing Peter told me when we were chatting was he's still working on the document now. So this user's guide that I had is from Watkins specifically, but it was made of the intent of being shown with the film in different areas, right? Whether it was for specific, political missives or political initiatives, like Watkins wrote this with the help of the New Zealand Foundation for Peace Studies, but also that this pedagogical endeavor comes with the film. But how exactly are these two linked, and do they work with each other? Well, Watkins seems to think so. And, the form of the documentary comes in tandem with this pedagogical intent. So he writes back in 1983, it was my first intention to make a film of approximately 2 or 3 hours in length. However, as the number of countries in which we filmed grew and the ideas for sequences and for people to interview extended, so did the raw footage that passed through the dozen different cameras that filmed the project all over the world. And he says, quote, "The decision to allow the journey to extend to 14 and a half hours was indeed a fateful one. And the price that we have paid for this decision and the meaning for the decision itself are all commented on the pages in the guide." But he says at the very end here, quote, "The second major decision I made regarding the journey, which was to construct the film into a series of units for screening in schools and to try and write an accompanying guide for teachers to use with these units." So he decided, the film ended up being 14 and a half hours, 14 hours and 33 minutes. So he decided to divide the film up into 19 units of 45 minutes or so at length. So when you watch the film, even now, it's on YouTube for free. It's many places on the internet. The DVD is difficult to find. But what this is saying is that there is a way in which this is a teachable document, as in the film in its form. The way it's divided up, the way its length has been categorized in these different sections has been done for the explicit purpose of education. So each chapter of the film, 19, has a corresponding unit in the guide. So the guide runs for over 400 pages. So each one has a different unit. Each unit goes through each chapter, and they go in through varying lengths, right? So again, you're meant to be watching it and engaging with this user's guide in a similar way, or at least it's one way of doing it. When Watkins writes about that, he says that this isn't about categorizing every scene in the journey. That's way too long. It'd be more than 400 pages that he says. What this is about providing and generating discussion. So what he says is that in the second paragraph on this slide, you can see this is all in the introduction to the guide as well. So there's an introduction, there's a chronology of events in the film, then there's the index, which is what Vida Urbanovic and Peter Watkins have done here, which is they design a guide to the guide, so an index where you can follow any theme, at any kind of context, any kind of event, right? So the way that the index works is it's not arranged alphabetically, and it's not even arranged by person. How it's arranged is under the headings of themes, contexts, ideas. You get to create your own lesson plan through these different ideas. So it generates discussion out of ideas there rather than you funneling things you would like to talk about into pre-designed categories within the actual guide. So even though it may appear difficult and even over-theorized, Watkins believes that using it this way, almost reverse engineering a lesson plan, if you will allow this kind of greater engagement with the audience. So this documentary and this pedagogy combine together to create an interactive and user-anchored guide into meaning-making through the film. But where exactly is this intervention coming from? What is the ideological basis of this intervention? Well, Watkins, again, for those who know or don't know, has written a tremendous amount about this, right? So he says here, when taking a look at how media studies is taught, how pedagogy with media has been, how he's looked at it is particularly in the late 80s and early 90s when this was written. And he says, and not altogether inaccurately, there is a current and major line of academic research which says this passivity is not true. The public negotiate their own private meaning from TV and use it to help them with their lives. A considerable number of academics today writing about the contemporary mass media stake their position on the premise that the medium of TV is here with us to stay. There is no denying this fact, and we might as well accept it for what it is and use it in the best way that we can. I made the journey from the deep conviction that this theory of negotiation leaves an immense amount to be desired, most notably that it leaves undiscussed the general lack of public movement to participate in public broadcasting. In other words, no matter how much people may privately negotiate meanings from the mass media, what happens in their public and political stances towards them? I say this in detail with every word because I believe this to be the crux not only of Watkins's intervention into media studies and why he has such a, some would say, psychotic passion for this kind of theorizing, but also what even draws maybe myself to this work or other scholars, because I think it can be difficult sometimes to get away from this negotiation aspect. It comes from a place of wanting to make the most and finding a way in for the viewer in a way that is very helpful and constructive. But when we use that as a political cudgel, crutch, if you will, to simply accept the parameters of capital by enjoying the media delivered to us under their pretenses, and being uncritical about its method, about its message, or about its delivery. So Watkins sees this maybe encoding, decoding, Stuart Hall era of viewing the mass media as a product through which we can recuperate, and says that this is not enough. This is not political. This is a personal tactic. This is not necessarily going to create transformational change in the world. And for a director like Watkins, there really is nothing else. And that rigidity is something that we'll get into a little bit as well. But this intervention comes from seeing the way that TV and film form has completely cut off the ability for us to engage with it critically. And instead, we have academics and media scholars who start at the position of, yes, this is a world of capital that determines basically how we get culture and what we get from it, but we're just going to ignore it. And that's something that Watkins cannot tolerate. So the way that he intervenes through it is the length of the film itself, 14 and a half hours worth, right? And what is this mainly made up of? It's not mainly made up of Watkins himself pontificating and theorizing. He has plenty of writing for that already. Instead, he says here that it's from the direct quotations through which the guide is anchored around. 60% or more of all the contents in the guide is verbatim the repeated words of the people in the film. And when you have so many interviewees from so many countries, so many backgrounds, what happens is the film broadens in its length. And the very project of capturing people discussing and thinking about these things became the crux of the theoretical project of The Journey in general. He even calls these discussion scenes, quote, structural building blocks here. And he says, quote, rather in the way of other films using individual shots or cuts, only here the blocks are much longer than usual. And says that the film's central gestalt is length, process, and complexity. There is a essay in the Willamette University Journal issue I mentioned earlier that calls in which Scott McDonald writes about how Watkins' film is process as product, product as process. And this length, process, and complexity, it's not meant to obscure, it's rather meant to elucidate and illuminate the enormous amount of perspectives in humanity around us. So this length, this process, there is a correlation that can be made in Pablo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, specifically his third chapter in the book on dialogical reasoning, dialogisms in general. So this is obviously a classic text. I'm sure many of you have read and studied this, but when it was published in English first in 1970, Friere is of a similar, dare I say, vintage as Watkins in a certain way, in terms of they are coming to these realizations about how to make the most out of teaching and education in a time of enormous political upheaval globally in the 60s and 70s. So dialogical reasoning and the ability of talking through these things is what Friere regards as truth even. So he says, quote, within the word we find two dimensions, reflection and action. And such radical interaction that if one is sacrificed even in part, the other immediately suffers. There is no true word that is not at the same time a praxis. There to speak a true word is to transform the world. And I think succinctly, this is how we can describe Watkins's project in a way. That by speaking through these things, these people see the world in a different way, and in that sense, transform it. Friere continues at the beginning of chapter 3 in his book, if it is in speaking their word that people, by naming the world, transform it, dialogue imposes itself as the way by which they achieve significance as human beings. Dialogue is thus an existential necessity. So again, when we think of Watkins's project, which is about nuclear holocaust and the nuclear bomb and its apocalyptic effects on us, the existential quality of articulating these fears becomes an absolute necessity in the way Friere says. He says, quote, true dialogue cannot exist unless the dialoguers engage in critical thinking, thinking which discerns an indivisible solidarity between the world and the people and admits no dichotomy between them, thinking which perceives reality as a process, as transformation rather than as a static entity. Right? So when we think of how Watkins calls himself, or says the film Central Gestalt deals with length and process, this process in Freire's estimation is directed towards political transformation. So we look at Watkins's intervention more clearly here. We start to see, well, there really is something interesting in how the film's length comes from hearing people stutter, stammer, repeat sentences, have run-on sentences, incomplete sentences. They riff off other people and look for ideas around the table as they discuss in real time. As these families, whether they're a family in the Midwest, a working class black family in the Midwest, whether they are the daughter of Hiroshima survivors, whether they live in Polynesia under the still neo-colonial rule of the French and their many illegal or legally, contentious nuclear facilities down there, or a Russian family who seems determined to feel something for their fellow man and yet defends the imperialist, in the film, the imperialist mission of invading Afghanistan with verve. Watkins's intervention is to give them time with all of these ideas. He's not here to make sure that people are right or wrong about what they're doing. Instead, it's about having an open forum, an open dialogue for you and the rest of the group to intervene and for the people in the film to intervene. I mean, even in his writing, you can see how on the left-hand side from the Willamette University journal issue, he stops his essay right in the middle of it and says, do you need a space? Here's a space. 3/4 of the page almost. It says, if you wish, please use it to write in any other statement you would have preferred I raise instead. Perhaps any way of phrasing the original statement. So he wants to give you time to talk back to him, to find your own, to do it your own way. And throughout the guide, he says over and over again, did you know any of this information before? Have you seen this information? How much of this information did you know? Have you heard of this before? But when Watkins is doing this isn't a political gotcha. This isn't meant to belittle people for not knowing. It's meant instead to invigorate them and empower them to learn and know these things, to want to know them, and to feel like they have a right to know how the world's money is being spent with weapons behind their back. So if we were to take Freire and Watkins and their programs, we would see that there is very much a similar pedagogical humanism here. So as Freire says towards the end of this chapter, in that third chapter, dialogue cannot exist in the absence of a profound love of the world and for people. The naming of the world is an act of creation and recreation. He says as well, dialogue cannot exist without humility. The naming of the world through which people constantly recreate the world cannot be an act of arrogance. Dialogue is the encounter of those addressed of the common task of learning and acting, right? Then finally, he says, dialogue requires an intense faith in humankind, faith in their power to make and remake, to create and recreate, faith in their vocation to be more fully human. Faith in people is an a priori requirement for dialogue. The dialogical man believes in others even before he meets them face to face. This is an aspect through which Watkins rests his entire case, which is that if people are given the chance to fully express themselves without the pressures of conforming or social niceties, then they will find a way to connect with other individual human beings. And then this hopelessness, as Friere says, as an act of silence, would be gone. And instead, that silence would be filled with thought and with dialogue and reflection. So, what are we to make of The Journey? A 14-and-a-half-hour movie, an entire pedagogical mission. One hazards to say it maybe was not successful in creating a new form of democratically infused participatory media. But that being said, it does seem as if this Cold War curio has amassed a new interest. We've had academic work by them, we've had screenings in the US and abroad, and think pieces written about the film just within the last few years. We also have a couple of very popular films that are dealing with nuclear apocalypse head on. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which won many Oscars, and Catherine Bigelow's new film, A House of Dynamite, which deals with a nuclear strike in real time, made with the specific instruction by Bigelow to remind us about the threat of nuclear annihilation. As the film moves into even more apocalyptic-leaning right-wing governments, and as little is done to prevent nuclear catastrophe or armament, Watkins' film and cry for a polyphonic human voice does seem to take on a true urgency that might we have listened to in 1987 could have averted certain disasters. Thank you all so much. I hope you all have a great rest of your conference and have a great time. Thank you.